Our guests today are in the studio Andrew Percy, Conservative MP for Brigg and Goole. And in our Westminster studio is George Galloway, the Respect MP for Bradford West. In Sheffield is Angela Smith, Labour MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge. George Galloway, if I can start with you. You've been at the centre of some controversy this week because within hours of Margaret Thatcher's death, you put out the remark, "Tramp the dirt down." Is that a respectful way to speak of our former leader?
Well, I didn't respect her in life. It would have been pure hypocrisy to pretend to do so in death. She murdered the north of the country. All the places that we're talking to now were devastated by her decade in power. She murdered the coal industry, she murdered the steel industry, she murdered the shipbuilding industry, merchant shipping and so on. So everybody watching this is living in a community which was murdered by Margaret Thatcher. So I'm more concerned about Thatcher's victims than about her.
Andrew Percy, I suspect, will take a different view.
Well, I do. I mean, at least George has been consistent in his views on Margaret Thatcher. But, you know, I grew up in Humberside, as it was then, throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s. And it's not true to say that the communities were murdered by Margaret Thatcher. Indeed, you know, the biggest land grant ever given for regeneration came from the Thatcher government to the city of Hull in the 1980s. But, you know, quite appropriately, I guess, and she'd probably like this herself, she divided opinion. But parts of our region, large parts of Yorkshire, certainly Lincolnshire, and certainly the area I represent now, swung very heavily behind Margaret Thatcher when she was in office, electing, you know, Conservative MPs in places where Conservative MPs weren't elected at the last election even. So, you know, she divided opinion, there's no doubt about that, but she did a lot of good for our region as well.
Angela Smith, why are so many Labour women sniffy about Margaret Thatcher? Didn't she pave the way for more women to succeed in politics?
Well, I mean, she certainly achieved the accolade of being the first female Prime Minister, but she pulled up the ladder behind her, didn't she? And the fact that we have so many Labour women MPs in Westminster now is not Margaret Thatcher's legacy. It's the legacy of the work that Labour women have done through the decades. People like Barbara Castle. That's the woman that we look up to as having achieved things for women. Margaret Thatcher didn't really do a great deal for women at all. And if I can return to the point, I think, you know, I want to be dignified and to show some respect, to show respect for Margaret Thatcher in death. But, like David Blunkett, I'd say one thing: I cannot forgive her for what she did to communities across South Yorkshire. She will never be forgiven in our area for what she did. She, as George Galloway said, she devastated the coal industry, severely damaged and devastated the steel industry as well, and we will never forgive her.
George Galloway, is it acceptable for people to celebrate the death of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I'm not myself celebrating, but the fact that some are is a measure, as Andrew said, of just how divisive a person she was. She was elected with big majorities, but on 40% of the vote. She never commanded anything like half of the support of the British people. She was only elected because of the traitors of the SDP, as it was, now squirming on the Tory coalition bench, and it was their defection from Labour and the votes that they took with them that allowed a Tory government with sufficiently large majorities to ram home their right-wing Thatcherite policy. That and the diversion of the Falklands War, which of course included the war crime committed against the ship, the Belgrano, where more than 300 young conscripts were sent to a watery grave on Mrs. Thatcher's own personal order, even though they were shot in the back as they were speeding away from the exclusion zone, were outside of the war and headed back to port.
What's your take on that version of history?
Well, it's certainly a unique version of history, and it's not one that I think the majority of people, particularly in regards to the Falklands, would relate to. I mean, the idea that, you know, taking out an enemy ship that had been zigzagging is in some way a war crime when we had had a piece of our territory invaded, I don't think really stands much scrutiny. However, in terms of Thatcher's broader legacy in our region, I think, you know, it is important to point out that for a lot of people, not necessarily, you know, so much women, but actually people from normal backgrounds, people like me who come from a traditional Labour background, we were attracted to Thatcher even at a very young age. I was attracted to that idea that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, if you work hard, you can be rewarded and you can do well for yourself. And that's something I and a lot of people in Yorkshire, because of course she got 44% of the vote, and that's a lot more than Tony Blair got in his years and any government has had since then. So, you know, there were a lot of people who were inspired by that message, taking into account, of course, that there are a lot of people in our region as well who have very strong emotions the other way.